Great. Am I good? Should I pause a lot then, or are we good? Okay. Welcome. We are here to celebrate the book launch of Katie Vagnino's first collection of poetry, Imitation Crab, from Finishing Line Press. And let's get into it. Katie Vagnino is a poet, educator, and writer originally from St. Louis, Missouri. She graduated from Yale, where she studied with poet and Yale Review editor J.D. McClatchy, and earned her MFA in creative writing at Emerson College. Katie's poetry has appeared in more than a dozen literary journals, including Measure, Unsplendid, the Raintown Review, and Poetry City USA, which is where I first read her. In 2017, her poem, How to Explain Death to Your Daughter, was published on Metro transit buses and trains in the Twin Cities. As a freelancer, her work has been published in the Minneapolis Star Tribune, The Verge, Time Out New York, The Establishment, Roll Reboot, and Pleiades Book Review. Other recent projects include co-authoring the exhibition catalog Two American Poets, Wallace Stevens and William Carlos Williams, and composing the libretto for Dreamless, a one-act opera that premiered at the Capitol Fringe Festival in 2018. Katie has taught creative writing, composition, research writing, and rhetoric at Emerson College, Roosevelt University, and the University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire. She has led poetry workshops at the Cambridge Center for Adult Education, the Newberry Library, the Loft Literary Center, and Artsake School of Arts Legacy program. Currently, she teaches a monthly poetry class hosted by Gree Literatura. When she's not writing or teaching, Katie can be found singing with her band, the Flaming Double Sides. Or
double wides.
What?
Flaming
double wides. Why did I say that? Oh, because I can't see. That's why I have glasses. Or serving on the board of St. Paul Almanac. She lives in Minneapolis with her husband, Jake, and their cat, George Muffins. To learn more, please visit katievagnino.com. And here she is, Katie Vagnino.
All right. I appreciate everyone's patience. I apologize, if there's funky lags. Hopefully you will be able to see and hear me. I think my video is going to be pinned here in a moment for the reading. So it's really awesome to see folks who have tuned in. I really want to thank David for being willing to host this reading, and also my lovely husband, Jake, who is helping us with the tech stuff. Yeah, I'm super excited. So I'm just going to read some poems from the book. I know many of you have ordered copies. If you haven't, you can get them from Finishing Line Press, and you can get them from Amazon. You can have your local bookstore order copies if you want to support them as well. But yeah, it's really awesome to have this book finally in the world. It was about a decade or so in the making, so it's very exciting to actually physically be able to hold it and smell it and touch it. And so I'm going to go ahead and read some poems from the book, starting with the title poem. Try to figure out what's the best way to do this. Imitation Crab. With practice, you can learn to spot a fake. Sloppy sleight of hand or a smile too slick gives it away. The truth is what we make of the mess we inherit. lessons we take away from blowing red-faced on trick candles. With practice, you can spot fake tans and breasts, crocodile tears at a wake, the forged signature on a permission slip or counterfeit check. The truth makes frauds of us once we see what's at stake. Pastel monopoly money, stacked thick. Children can always spot a fake, detect the bullshit in stories half-baked. They know the Santa at the mall is not authentic. The phony beard gives him away. But they make believe and sit on his lap because the truth shakes them to the core. Everyone lies and nothing is magic. With practice, you can tell the real from the fake. But unless you're the crab, what difference does it make? Mise en scene. You pantomime making breakfast while your husband does his best impression of a man who likes his wife's coffee. Is your line, have a good day at work? Or don't forget the dry cleaning? You can't remember, so instead, cross up stage and ask him to take the dog you don't have for a long walk. He ad-libs a kiss on the cheek and asks about dinner as he grabs a waxed banana from the centerpiece. Without conflict, there is no drama. Either Aristotle or your therapist said that. Whatever you do, don't mention the character who never arrived, the room repainted red from robin's egg blue, your sister's hand-me-downs you gave to Goodwill. Remember, it's like they say on airplanes, the closest exit may be behind you. Souvenir. At the museum gift shop, we searched for the perfect artifact, something to remind us of the afternoon spent lost in the galleries, marveling at how well-preserved objects in controlled environments can be. Among the charmingly useless keepsakes, Fabergé egg-shaped soaps, a book on the history of buttonholing, you told me souvenir comes from the French irregular verb, to remember. You speak French? I said. We left without buying anything, and you left a month later. Now I souvenir your cleft chin and the skyline of books stacked along your bedroom floor. I souvenir how abruptly we became unnecessary to each other, like the bronze paperweight in the shape of Degas' ballerina you told me not to waste my money on. How to explain death to your daughter. Tell her on a cloudless afternoon, a Sunday in November, maybe, after the leaves have fallen and the ground's first hard freeze, or during spring's first inkling, before the buds or birds are back. When she asks questions that are impossible to answer, touch the top of her perfect head and say that death is necessary, as natural as sugar dissolving in a glass of lemonade, leaving its essence to linger. May Day. In debutante gowns of ivory brocade and lace, we parade across the lawn and curtsy to the crowd in pairs, daisies braided in our hair. Our brothers and boyfriends watch from the sidelines, snickering at the girls who stumble and those they say shouldn't be wearing white. A Copeland song begins the dance. Around the maypole, we weave and unweave satin ribbons patiently as an army of Penelopes. One girl is crowned queen and handed a bouquet of baby's breath and roses, while the rest of us hide our heartbreak. Our mothers clap the hardest. They know how it feels to be on the cusp of 18 when everything still seems effortless as a daffodil. The storm. Caught in the maw of it, it's easy to believe in God's opposite. Absence of tenderness, winter fury whistling like 1,000 tin cans dragged from a fleet of wedding hearses, rice in the tire ruts. On nights like this, when clouds upstage the stars, I dream I am lightning, or a cigarette lit too long. My body, a lighthouse, beacon made of bone. So those are some poems from the first section of the book, and some of my favorites. One of the lines, the last line of mise en scene, the closest exit may be behind you, was actually a contender for the book title. But ultimately, I decided I wanted something stranger. The next poems I'm going to read, I asked Jake, what should I read? What are some of your favorites? And he expressed that he's particularly fond of the poems in the book that feature, little critters, which is kind of a motif. There are a lot of, other than the titular crab, there are lots of sort of bugs and small creatures and animals that kind of inhabit the book. So I'm going to read some of those poems. And, feel free to put your requests in the chat. But I'm going to start with Raw Bar, which is about one of my favorite animals to eat. Raw Bar. Among the lemon crescents and crushed ice, a dozen Duxbury oysters still alive. I pry them from their shells, dollop twice with cocktail sauce, and swallow. After 5, I'm almost full, salt stinging my lips, till a sip of water brings my hunger back. Armed with a tiny fork, I make the kill, spilling brine like blood. They taste metallic, like oceanic coins harvested in steel cages alongside their mussel and clam cousins. What, if anything, do they feel when cracked open by a sous chef's hands, arranged by size on a plate left to right, sliding down my throat without a fight? Small mammals of Tree Haven. What is life like for the least weasel? Does he mean the most to anyone? He should be scurrying through Northwood's underbrush, sniffing out lesser rodents, living his best wild weasel life. Instead, he's trapped here beneath a sheet of plexiglass, like a sad, furry hot dog, incapable of menace. To his right sits a star-nosed mole with claws like acrylic press-on nails that look too long to be natural. His namesake snout protrudes like a vacuum cleaner attachment. Were he alive, he'd surely smell the 5 varieties of shrew: pygmy, masked, water, Arctic, northern short-tailed, pinned alongside him, preserved for children on field trips to marvel. Portrait of the Common Loon by an unknown artist. In this depiction, she looks unoffended by the designation of ordinary, a label assigned to her by some scientist who cannot fly or live among lily pads, who must wear clothes to keep warm, whose calls often go unanswered. She gazes off left, her infrared eye focusing on something in the middle distance beyond the frame. Her mate, or a predator, perhaps, or a motorboat sending ripples across the bay. Still, she remains unruffled, content with herself and at peace with her place in the water. The artist who painted her can relate. Why sign your work when it is unremarkable except in its proficiency, its accuracy in rendering an everyday bird going about its business, unresentful of rarer creatures more deserving of attention? Fire Island Rubato. Out here, the houses all have names. Dune Well, Seize the Day, Comfortably Numb. From our porch, we watch the divers waiting for the slack tide. There's safety in stillness, but they have to time it right. The pause between the ocean's allegro and andante when the waves hold their applause. I feel like I have blood to spare today, so I show mercy to the mosquitoes. Let them draw me out in drops. You slice a tomato with the precision one might string a violin. You never measure sugar or salt. Long days decrescendo to nights. The fireflies look fat enough to power more than just themselves. The next poem I'm going to read, this one it has a dedication. It's for my parents who met in an adult education class called Gourmet Cooking for Singles, which I've been told I just referred to it as Cooking for Singles. My mother corrected me. It's Gourmet Cooking for Singles was the name of the class. And the poem is called Cook Until Done. On the first day, they made consommé. The way his hands cracked the eggs, whipped their whites into a frenzy, stirred something inside her. The way his hands cracked the eggs made her wonder how he'd handle her. Something stirred inside her when he finally asked her out on a date. He wondered how she'd handle herself when he ordered Chianti at dinner. On the date, he asked all the usual things, noticed her eyes were hazel like his. He ordered more Chianti at dinner when she said their matching initials were a sign and noticed his eyes were hazel like hers. He stroked her hand, offered to drive her home. She said their matching initials must be a sign, picturing pairs of monogrammed towels. He stroked her hand, invited her to his home. 8 months later, she was still there, picturing pairs of monogrammed towels. Watching him was like waiting for water to boil. 8 months later, she was still there, without a ring, not getting any younger, but a watched pot never boils. At last, she proposed an ultimatum. I need a ring, I'm not getting any younger. That September, he caved in at last to her ultimatum, a proposal to consummate their love in marriage. 18 Septembers later, it all caved in. Both were whipped, but the frenzy was gone. So I think once I finish reading, David's gonna ask me some questions about form. That one I just read is a pantoum, so there's a lot of repetition. So if you were like, wait, she already said that line, that's actually part of the form. This next one is pretty new. And it's called Useful Animal. And it has an epigraph, which is a quote from Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who's the author of the Yellow Wallpaper. This is actually from a letter that she wrote, not from that piece. But the quote is, myself as a self, you know, not merely as a woman or that useful animal, a wife and mother. Useful animal. The night before my surgery, I threw my breasts a goodbye party. They deserved a proper send-off, commemoration for their years of cumbersome service. But what about breastfeeding? My mother wanted to know. The surgeon told me to prepare to be possibly unable to provide milk for children I might never have, that I could be sacrificing the sensation of being suckled by my barely sentient baby. And for what? To wear cuter bras and sleep on my belly like a sloth, that adorably useless animal? My best friend bought a cake with tits as big as mine from an erotic bakery. Let me cut the first slice. I like to think it was a man who baked it. I imagine him imagining me topless, delicately crafting my areolas in pink buttercream, his erection trapped under the apron ironed by his wife that morning. That is a true story. There was a goodbye party, and there was a cake that had boobs. It's very eerie to do this without like people reacting or like laughing or clapping, or I have no idea what y'all are doing in the chat. But at any rate, I just turned 40. So that's fun. And I wrote this poem. Donald Justice has a poem called Men at 40 that's quite famous. So I decided to sort of write an answer to his poem. This is called Women at 40. Women at 40 learn to slam loudly, doors opened by men expecting something in return. In elevators, they unlearn how to make themselves small as they ascend past floors where their grandmothers clerked or cleaned. They have no use for mirrors. They know their faces well from years of applying lipstick in taxis, public bathrooms, dark corners of bars their mothers warned them about when a bad reputation was the worst thing they could imagine. Their daughters will know better. When metaphors fail them, as metaphors often do, they will finally arrive at a place where the only voice they listen to is their own. Homewrecker. You can't blame the hornets for being perturbed. For months, maybe years, their nest had hung there, tucked behind the screen door's hinge, undisturbed until you discovered it. I whispered a prayer while you, armed with a rolled up magazine, demolished what had been made with care. I would have stung you. Maybe it was mean of me to laugh, but the way your nostrils flared as you swung your arms and your posture, threatening, yes, but more clumsy than fierce, reminded me of myself at 15, unsure of my breasts, my voice, my nose piercing. Their home destroyed, you smiled, satisfied. The threat was gone, or at least exiled outside. I think I'll just read a few more. I feel like I've been reading a lot of the sort of heavy ones. So this one's kind of dark, but hopefully funny, meant to be funny. It's called The Worst Metaphors for Our Relationship. Court transcript with the juicy parts redacted. Banquet hall buffet, wisdom teeth impacted. An ambulance driving with its siren off. Our once firm mattress now going soft. Boring B-roll on the director's cut. Drug trial placebo, pay-per-view smut. Marathoner on mile 20 losing steam. Chernobyl, Pompeii, Hiroshima. A dream dissolved upon waking. A play with no plot. A gift basket of fruit just starting to rot. Passed out before 12 on New Year's, too drunk to get it up. A flat tire, no spare in the trunk. A mine of conflict diamonds. Souffle that won't set. A sing-song sonnet of rhyming couplets. Uh, my stepmom told me that this is one of her favorites, so I thought I would read it. Algorithms. 1. Only after discovering a common denominator can two come together cleanly. Remainder implies something left over or left out, conspicuous. Like how I felt on the last day of 4th grade when I found out the answers had been in the back of my math textbook all along. 2. The best kind of problem to be is an unsolvable one. And if you end up becoming a fraction, you should strive to be improper. 3. I can't remember how to find the slope of a line, but I know it has to do with distance, how far from one point to the next, how steep the journey. 4. Oh, to be a perfect integer, smug in the knowledge of my wholeness. Nocturnal. Night descends and the city starts to sweat. You call me the wrong name, but I don't care. I think I love you, though we've only just met. Police sirens wail an angry duet, a Doppler opera swirling through the air as night descends and the city starts to sweat. You offer to light my cigarette, and we grope like teenagers, desire laid bare. I think I love you, though we've only just met. A homeless man mumbles a threat to the deserted alley as the unfair night descends. The city starts to sweat drops of yes and now. My lips are wet. Yours are somewhere in my hair. I think I love you, and we've only just met, but this might be as close as I'll ever get, so I'll take my rapture with a little despair. Night descends, and the city starts to sweat. I think I love you. Don't leave me yet. And I think the last one I'll read, unless people want me to read more, but we'll see how this goes. This has been really fun. It's fun to read my poems. I miss doing this in person. Hopefully after the pandemic, I'll get to read sometime in person soon, but I appreciate you guys tuning in to join us on YouTube. And stick around because David's going to ask me some questions. You can put questions in the chat. We'll hang out for a little bit. But at any rate, thanks. This poem is called Your Dreams Explained. Rotting teeth mean money troubles. Molars loose in the mouth, like coins rattling in a car cup holder, never enough for the toll. If you dream of being a fish, a trout, say, swimming upstream, you might be anxious about work, or the fact that your wife's skin suddenly reminds you of scales. You catch yourself wondering how she'd look hooked by the gums. Waking up wet with visions of Ted from next door means you'd like to have sex with Ted from next door. Vegetables represent repressed anger toward your mother, who is to blame for your cauliflower complexion, your distaste for cooked fruit. Flying is a sign of a lover's betrayal. You are gravity abandoned. Thank you. So I think now David will turn his camera back on, hopefully, and yay, there he is.
And I should be unmuted too.
I can hear you. I hope things are still going well technologically. I don't really know. Yeah. So, yeah, David, what do you?
Well,
lead this Q&A.
whatever you no. Thank you very much, Katie. That was fantastic. I always love hearing you read, and I am very happy to be able to read your poetry. for a variety of reasons. But first off, I want to, there's just so much to chew on this, in this book, even, you know, especially if you give it to your dog, and I'm sure then they'll chew on it. But so first off, Imitation Crab itself, the poem, is that, well, first off, it's a fantastic poem, and I'm wondering how many times you've had to endure people coming up to you and explaining to you exactly what the poem is that you wrote. But would you call this kind of the thesis statement in a way of the book? Why start with this one? When you were thinking about calling the book by another name, we're going to start with a different poem.
Yeah, I picked this poem. I do think it is kind of, I see it as almost maybe like a little bit of, the poem kind of serves as a maybe an explanation or a key to sort of like reading the rest of the book. Because I think, like the kind of epigraphs to the collection, like something when I look at all the poems as a whole that seems to sort of resurface is, questions about kind of identity, and in particular, you know, female identity, performativity. You know, I used to be an actress, so the very first poems I wrote were like persona poems, and I continue to be just kind of interested in you know, this idea that to some extent we are sort of all characters, and we're kind of playing different roles with different people in our lives. And yeah, I just sometimes I feel like we've all had that experience where you're in some sort of a social situation and you realize you're kind of performing to some extent. So I think the poem kind of talks about or is interested in those layers of artifice, and you know what that means to our, you know, authentic selves. And you know, I like villanelles a lot as a form. And this particular one, I sort of had the first line of the refrain in my head for a while, but I couldn't figure out the second half of it. So I like this idea of sort of practicing and learning to discern between sort of the real and the fake, but then ultimately, is that really that a useful skill? Like, how much is there even a difference? Like, the distinctions just get really blurry, I think. You know, culturally, it's something I'm kind of interested in. So yeah, I guess it just like to me feels like it brings together like a lot of different sorts of themes and ideas. And I like it as a poem. I thought it would make for a fun, weird title. So
Yeah, it does. It makes for a very arresting title, actually, for a book, I find. Yeah, it seems like a lot of what you have going on in the book are, you know, there's a few continual themes that seem to be getting batted back and forth within the poems. And one really is that question of the ability to discern between real and fake. You've got, I mean, quite a few here that are exactly about that.
especially with regards, I think, to like relationships, you know,
Right.
a lot of there are a lot of relationships that seemed very real, and very, you know, built to last, and then that can be sort of an illusion or it falls away. And I think that's, you know, one of the kind of traumas that a lot of us experience, and that,
Mhm.
uh, you know, it makes you question, like, well, was it real?
Mhm.
Did I lose my mind? So
Right, and you go right in. I mean, mise en scene is exactly that. You know, the whole. I mean, right at the start, you pantomime making breakfast. I mean, so you're imitating it. And one of the things I thought was really interesting too is while there's a lot about love lost, it doesn't feel like there's not, how do I put this? There's not like a tragedy to it. It just feels more like, I was writing this down and how do I put it? It feels more like it wasn't just eventually became an unsatisfying love. I mean, it doesn't feel like there's anything in here that's like you being a jilted lover or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a good observation. I think there's acceptance. I mean, there's like grief, I think, about the loss of some of these relationships, but there's also like just a sense, I hope, of it's just the way that it plays out. I don't know, there's grief, I think, but there's also kind of acceptance and moving on. I don't think there's angry anger, but it is, those are still losses that and I think a lot of the poems that was a topic that I think resonated with me for a long time, just like as someone who loves very deeply. I find often ruminating after the fact, and that sort of made its way into some of these poems. But at the same time, I think there's also sort of realizations of the ways in which the relationship was flawed, not just even that the individuals were flawed, but the relationship was in some way dysfunctional. And worst metaphors, I just it's not an explosion, right? I mean, that's like, all those are metaphors for, I mean, there are some, I guess, meltdowns, nuclear meltdowns listed, but most of the examples are just kind of like, things that have sort of deflated or rotted, or the good stuff has been taken out, or.
Yeah, it really doesn't seem like, there's a huge hole of regret about leaving this relationship. More like, yeah,
but I think that's
better off.
True. I think that's a true experience. Yeah. So.
And there's also another thing I noticed is, and you mentioned about small animals, but along with that, there's a real, a lot of poems about just ordinariness. Obviously the one on the common loon, but even was it the Tree Haven? Was it? Yeah, Small Mammals of Tree Haven. Just like the least weasel?
A real species.
I know it, but it's not. It was like, when I read that, it's like, oh, what a fantastic way to start. And yes, there is a least weasel.
Yeah, I think I like kind of, I do think there's a lot of, there's magic and wonder in life, of course, but there's also banality, and there's also least weasels. So, yeah, I'm not entirely sure what the presence of the small critters means. It was just something when I was kind of looking at the poems as a whole and the manuscript, I was like, well, when I was trying to figure out how to organize things and what the sort of themes were, and I was like, well, I guess I do notice I seem to be drawn, my imagery often, and figurative language, I tend to go for kind of descriptions or comparisons to kind of animals and creatures, and particularly insects, which is weird. I think I'm not aware of being particularly fond of insects, but like, fireflies and mosquitoes and butterflies. I meant to read Vera versus the Butterflies.
I was going to say, I was surprised you didn't read that.
I know. I have it on the playlist, and I just skipped right over it accidentally. But
you want to read it now?
Yeah, I can read it now.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah, please.
My favorites. It's fond of it. It's the end I put it in an important place. I think when you're like putting together a book, like, I put it at the end of the first section because I felt like that was a good home for it. But yeah, this is basically about Vera and Vladimir Nabokov, and they were, I think it's pronounced lepidopter. I can never pronounce the word. They collected butterflies, and it was, kind of part of their relationship. And so the poem begins with a quote from a letter that he wrote to his wife Vera in 1937. The eastern side of every minute of mine is already colored by the light of our impending meeting. All the rest is dark, boring, viewless. Vera versus the butterflies. She had already lost him, and now his winged darlings were hers to keep or kill. She shared his fascination with fragility and flight, but walking in the woods alone, armed with the net he had given her, noting each abandoned chrysalis, unusual flecks of blue on a Parnassus Apollo, she knew they had to go. A book suggested pinching thorax between thumb and middle finger to snap the exoskeleton for a quick death, but she couldn't bear their blood on her hands. Suffocation in a kill jar, too inhumane. She decided finally to freeze them, let the air do her dirty work. Watching their wings pulse to stillness, she imagined his delight at the sudden flutter of company, diaphanous prologue to their reunion.
Wow.
Oh, thanks.
But there's such beautiful language in that, and butterflies are such beautiful creatures, but they do, although you didn't discuss it, of course, they go from being a very common thing and then cocooning and coming out. But the language like chrysalis and diaphanous, that's just, that is legitimately beautiful language. And of course, you use, then there's a whole poem that you have later on called Chrysalis, which we'll get to. So that to me doesn't feel like a very common sort of thing, like the same way as like the poor least weasel, or or the common loon. And especially since this Vera and Vladimir Nabokov, luminaries.
Pretty extraordinary people, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely not ordinary, or at least in any sense. There's another thing that I noticed too. You have, and this surprises me, there is an awful lot about the ocean and the seaside in this. So more specifically, really the seaside, and I think specifically, it seems to me the Atlantic coast. And you're from Wisconsin and St. Louis, but the beginning of every section here, you start with Imitation Crab, then section 2 starts with Raw Bar, all about oysters and Duxbury oysters in particular, and then Fire Island Rubato. Fire Island is an island off New York City and Long Island. So what gives? Why? Where's that coming from?
I do think I'm drawn to, I'm a Pisces, and I love, everything kind of related to the ocean and the sea. And I think, those are places, I spent a lot of time on the East Coast in school, undergrad and then grad school. And then my mom lives in Florida. She lives in St. Augustine. So there's a poem. She used to live in Jacksonville Beach. So there's a poem about us.
Oh, that's Jack's Beach. Okay.
Yeah. That's what they call Jacksonville Beach. That's like shorthand for it. But so yeah, I just, Fire Island, I spent like a weekend there, and it was really magical, and it just felt sort of out of time, which is why rubato is part of the title there, because it just, there was something about the quality of the light and just the way
I was
time
going to ask about that. Yeah.
that, you know, rubato is a musical term that basically means, you know, in the piece, you have to watch the conductor very closely because he's taking, you know, he's going to go out of time.
Slow
So,
down. Yeah.
you know, it can slow it. It can mean slowing things down, or it just means that whatever time signature you're in doesn't apply for the rubato section. At least that's a rough approximation of what it means. I hope there are probably musicians here who are just like, that's not exactly what it means. But
Really.
yeah, you know, it's, so I wanted, so yeah, I think that it's just really places. I spent 4 years in Boston. I worked at a restaurant where we served oysters, so I ate a lot of oysters. So like in some ways, those are kind of, you know, timestamps of different like, uh, you know, times, periods in my life where I was like living kind of more coastally than I am now. Um, and yeah, I think, you know, I don't know if there's much more to it other than I'm just drawn to those places, and I do really like being near water, being in or near the ocean. Um, so where the real
Mhm.
crabs are.
Now, I also thought it was really interesting from Imitation Crab and then Raw Bar. I mean, you have fake seafood and then like real, still living
Yep, they're alive until you like.
seafood, which you make a big point about, which get me. It's like, oh no, maybe I shouldn't eat oysters again.
Well, yeah, I don't know. What do they feel sliding down your throat without a fight? I don't know. uh, yeah.
And another thing I noted that I warned you I was going to ask about is it does seem that midway through the second part, you go on a slightly the moralistic decline. Starting with, I think originally it was going to say starting with Slut Villanelle, because that like really hits you, just that title. But I really think Dear Meathead is where it starts, right before, right before
Well,
it.
I don't know. I don't put a lot of judgment. To be clear, you know, I think there's complexity. I don't, you know, like I'm certainly not saying, I mean, in some sense, you know, slut is like this negative term that's
Mhm.
applied to women who like, you know, it doesn't get applied, like men can't really be sluts. Like it's this very gendered term. And the behavior, you know, described in that poem, um, you know, is what other people would sort of label slutty. So um, I think, you know, where I think women's sexuality, you know, they get, you know, women get sort of demonized for being sexual beings. And yeah, there's definitely, I think the book in the second section starts to kind of explore, um, yeah, some of the labels that either get applied to women or that women sort of apply to themselves. I mean, like Dear Meathead is kind of an interesting example because um, sort of a fantasy, if you will, of the speaker sort of seeing this man who is not at all what she would sort of consider her type or someone she would date. He doesn't really resemble the men she's with, but is clearly having sort of a sexual fantasy about him. Um, and you know, yeah, there's sort of some inner surveilling, I think, going on about what, you know, what does that mean and
Mhm.
why is she sort of having this sort of fantasy. um but yeah, I think there's just like transgressions, like there are just like women in the book and female sort of characters in the book who transgress in different kinds of ways.
Mhm.
And yeah, even something like aging, which is sort of part of women.
Right. Well, women over 40 right there.
Yeah, so I think they're just, I think particularly there's a lot of artifice when I think about the title of the poem and the sort of central theme of sort of artifice and reality, like gender is, a construct, and there's like a lot of artifice that goes into sort of gender performance
Right, right.
here. And especially, I think it's true for men as well. I mean, I think there are ways that
Mhm.
men perform masculinity. But, women, it's like, and that's part of why I love these like women on the cover, because, they look kind of like they're gossiping, and they have these like crazy accessories, and there's just like the trappings of femininity. I think about this. I love, as anyone who knows me knows, I really love drag. I love going to see drag shows. And I think it's really interesting to compare kind of drag kings and drag queens just in the aesthetic, because it's just like there's a lot more stuff that you do to perform womanhood. Whereas when women are performing men, they're often stripping down, they're
Right,
reducing
right.
their breasts, they're becoming more plain. And, the other way, it's additions. There's lots of adding of things, of
Right,
curves,
right.
heels, makeup, and jewelry, so yeah, I mean, I do think, you know, I don't know. I would like to think that this book is, feminist, and that there's like feminist themes in the book. But it's also just, I'm kind of, as a woman, drawn to sort of women's experiences and kind of filtering things through that lens.
Mhm.
Um, and I think it's especially sort of relevant with these sorts of questions of authenticity and artificiality
Mhm.
and role playing.
Yeah, and it's um well, I just need to read the first first two lines no, first three of Dear Meathead. It's hard to believe you have chromosomes in common with the men I typically date. And it's interesting, you say you were talking about judgment and like transgressing against judgment. And certainly this, just to read the titles of what I'm talking about from Dear Meathead to the end of part two. You have Dear Meathead, Slut Villanelle, You Were in My Dream Last Night, which um, uh, contains some transgression in that. Junk Mail Gazelle, or Guzzle, excuse me, Knife Work. Oh, and Sistina Noir. I love that one. Oh my gosh, that is just fan. I love poems that try to do like noir, and that one is fantastic. Uh, yeah, but at the last line of Dear Meathead says exactly that. There is no judge for thoughts. So you're kind of going on that course. And then starting with three, you go straight into, after Fire Island Roboto, into what I think are the two, appear to me as a man, as male identified, two most hardcore feminist statements, which I think are Sisters and Women at 40. At least that's how I see it.
Yeah, I think, when I think about how I wanted to kind of the journey I wanted to take people on in terms of reading the poems, I think a lot of the poems in the first section kind of relate to, um, I don't know, they feel sort of like they're kind of setting the stage. There's some, kind of like some kind of family stuff. Then I kind of like in the second section thought, well, this is when I'll get kind of weird and edgy and surreal. And as we were talking before we started the stream, like, it gets a little bit sort of sexual and transgressive and surreal. And then yeah, the third section, the beginning, there's like what that's kind of brought up.
Mhm.
Um, these expressions of kind of like the aftermath of that, I guess. And, sort of in the third section, leveling a little bit back out, sort of like, well, okay, where are we now?
Mhm.
But I don't know, I love that you say that when you read it, it had a really clear through line. I mean, for me, it's always been, really hard to figure out how to kind of organize these things and what sort of story they tell kind of as a whole, as opposed
Mhm.
to individually. Um, but I do think, yeah, I think there's like, I tried to kind of put most of the, what I would say, sort of surreal or absurd poems kind of in the middle, so that readers could kind of like go down that rabbit hole
Mhm.
and maybe feel a little uncomfortable and weird,
Which
and
I
then kind of
totally respect.
emerge, and then kind of come back out and like things, okay, we're back sort of in the realm of reality now, um, where things are a little less funhouse mirror, but yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's just like, there are poems that kind of began, when I was in grad school, and sort of have changed a lot and evolved. And then there's a chunk of poems that are like pretty new, including the title poem, that are from, the last maybe 5 years.
Mm.
Um, so it's yeah, it's hard. I like talking about, my work, but it's also, it's like very close. I'm very familiar
Right.
with all of these poems. I remember like all of the drafts and all the different changes I made, and
Yeah.
yeah, and I think it's also, now it's out in the world, right? So people can kind of decide what they're about, or make their own
Yeah.
decisions about what they're about, and that's as valid as what I sort of intended. Like, I just think
Mhm.
with any poetry, like, you know, once it's out there, it's out of your control, and there are going to be other meanings that readers create and form, and they're not really any more valid than what I was sort of necessarily trying to say. So I think that's something really exciting about when poems are out in the world.
Mhm.
I'm excited to hear, I love it. I've always loved it, in a workshop, when someone says something about a poem that's like, I love how you did this, and you have no idea that you did that. And you're like, oh,
Yep.
I guess I did do that. Cool. So I think that's fun. I like that. That doesn't freak me out. I'm never going to be like, no, that's wrong. But that's what I think is so cool about poetry. Cause I do think there's stuff that you don't know that you're doing, that like other people that may
Right,
not
right, right.
notice, but it doesn't mean it's not there. So
Mhm.
yeah, I think it's also been fun just to hear from people what poems they, have responded to, what they like, and
Mhm.
that's been really cool to hear from people. Yeah.
So that all leads to a question, which I think is interesting, because I've been identifying these through lines in this and turns in the book. I mean, there's places where you have, you know, where you have two poems facing each other and they're perfect. Like I said, Sisters and Women at 40. Mise en scene and Souvenir are perfect, like facing each other. How did you, uh, so how did you go about organizing the book?
I well, I had help. I was really feeling lost, and I sent the manuscript to a friend who's a poet. He's also the guitarist in the Flaming Double Wides, uh, John Loomis, who's also, he's a poet, and we were on the faculty together at UW Eau Claire, and he's written several books. And I was like, would you take a look at this and like, just, tell me what you think? Maybe if you feel like it, take a stab at organizing this thing. And a lot of his order is the final order. Like, I actually
Oh,
really,
wow.
he broke it into three kind of sections. And I liked that. And yeah, I think of it when I was thinking about it, I thought of it kind of like, it's almost like when you're making a mixtape. And you
Yes.
want to think about
Yes.
how the end of one poem kind of maybe sets up the beginning of the next poem. So it's like, it's kind of about the transitions and like,
Mhm.
I think there's two different strategies. Like you can try to do something jarring, like really have a hard swerve, you know, tonally from one poem to the next. Like that can be a desirable effect. I think for me, I more was looking for kind of, you know, yeah, poems. I kind of would find two or three poems that felt like they went together, you know, so I would
Right, right.
group them together and then think about, okay, how do these poems maybe speak to, you know, the next section? Like if we're already kind of on a beach, like maybe
Mhm.
we'll stay kind of in a beach.
Right,
Or
right.
um, yeah, I'm trying to think if there's any like particular like examples. I mean, I knew kind of the big, you know, Imitation Crab wasn't always the first poem in the book. It was always in the first like few. And then eventually because sometimes I like, oh, does it have to be the first poem if it's the title poem? But then I ultimately like,
Really?
I wanted it to be first. But um, yeah, I mean, I think kind of, you know, like Dead Dog and Oxford, Mississippi are both kind of Southern. I don't know if you necessarily Dead Dog is actually, you know, inspired by a story a friend of mine who grew up in Alabama told me. So even though it isn't really referenced as, you might not sort of locate it as the South.
Mhm.
Um, to me, I think of it as being sort of about a childhood in the South. So then putting that with Oxford, Mississippi, which is kind of based on um, Faulkner characters, and also kind of young youth kind
Right.
of growing up in the South. So like, you know, I wanted those to kind of go together. And I think, you know, Oxford, Mississippi leading into still life, there's sort of a loss of innocence and a loss of relationship. So I guess I kind of just tried to build it kind of block by block with kind of grouping together poems that seem
Mhm.
to kind of be in conversation with each other. Um,
Right.
you know, and how to explain death to your daughter. It's sort of imagining maybe a parent talking to a daughter, that leading into May Day. There's references to kind of parents there, and you know, like a sort of rite of passage into motherhood, and maybe in the same way learning about death, it's sort of a rite
Mhm.
of passage, you know, an end of innocence, sort of, you know, learning about something kind of in childhood. So that's kind of how I did it. I mean, there's probably other ways they could have been organized, but I'm glad you like the way it ended up. So
Well, and I love it. It's so satisfying to have. I mean, I know it might be strange to say this, you know, because you would want great poems page to page, and that should be enough. But it's like I said, I see these through lines, and they're so well done, and I love the whole thing of, you know, various things like starting part one with Imitation Crab, and then Raw Bar, and then for part two. But even all the way down the learning curve, the final poem ends with this great line. You know, after this entire book of poetry, the last sentence that you have in the book is, "I am not a poet." It's just fantastic. Was that also an intention? Like, you know, this should be the last one right there.
yeah, that felt like a sort of mic drop, I get. I mean, well, but also the point of the poem is that it's a lie, you know, like which is very true for me because like
Right,
it took me a really long time to self-identify as a poet. Like for a long time I
right.
poems, but I didn't really tell people I did that, you know, and then even in grad school I was kind of like, well, maybe I'll write fiction and switch over. So I think
Hmm.
for a long time I didn't really like sort of claiming that mantle. So it feels significant to me to
I
know.
think that's a standard thing for a poet.
Right. And to know
Hmm.
now that it is who I am and that that is a lie, like to say I'm not a poet is false, is an untruth.
Hmm.
That feels sort of empowering to name it. It's artificial, right? It's, you know, I can pretend I'm not a
Hmm.
poet, but I am. And I can't really escape it. um, I saw in the chat that my mom
Right.
really wants me to read Chrysalis. Do you mind if I read
Yeah.
Chrysalis?
Yeah, go ahead. I was.
All right. Don't want to anger the mom. Who is
No. Especially when what she says is, in honor of Nana, Susie, and me, your mom.
Yeah. Well, and you know, my Nana passed away in September. She was 102. So she did know this poem. She was blind, so I would make audio recordings of me reading my poems and share them with her. So she did definitely get to hear this poem, and yeah, I will read it. I will read it from my mom, and then we should probably try to wrap it up because I imagine people want to get on with their evenings. But I'll read this poem, and then maybe we can.
I would
know.
be a great segue into my questions about form.
All right, I'll let you ask your one question.
I'm surprised you've gone this far without me doing that.
I'll read the poem. We can talk a little bit about form, and then we'll call it a night.
Okay.
Chrysalis, for the Grayson women. In Aunt Susie's kitchen, 3 women flutter like agitated moths, discussing movies and weather, but never men or politics. Susie, armed with a bottle of Tabasco and wearing a shirt that says "Gravity's a bitch," checks on the brisket. Her red nails match mine, and my mom wonders if we planned it that way. Hungry, I wonder if we'll eat before 10, if the flakes fluttering down will stick. On the radio, Red Allen croons about stormy weather. Nana, 90 and reliable as gravity, rises from her nap. Are 2 bottles going to be enough? My mom asks, a bottle of Zinfandel in her hands. Nana wonders aloud if the store is still open. The gravity of the situation sets in. Amid the flutter of concerns about the inclement weather, I pour myself a generous glass. The red wine warms my throat, soothing as Red's voice. Mom signals to me, pass the bottle. 2 hours later, as they argue over whether I should keep trying to be an actress, I wonder if I'll ever learn to cook brisket, if the flutter I feel is from the wine or the pull of gravity in my chest. A curious thing, gravity, I think, as I watch my mom and her sister wipe red stains from their lips. The snow is no flutter, it's a full-blown storm. Nothing stays bottled up forever. Sometimes I wonder. Nana trails off. I want to ask her whether she believes in second chances, whether she fears death, what's beyond the grave. But I say nothing. Susie laughs. I wonder if we have room for dessert. I've got red velvet cake. The brisket and both bottles of wine are gone. In a minute, I will flutter off with the empty bottles. I'll overhear them lamenting gravity's effect on their weathered bodies and comparing books recently read while I flutter around the kitchen like a firefly lit within from wonder. Love you, Mom.
Oh, I love that one.
So
this is the thing, and I wish everybody could see the poem. I wish everybody could see how the poem is written, because this is the thing that I find fantastic about your work. And it's also a nice little marketing trick. Since I know you write a lot in form, I read the poem and then I have to look at it again and do things like count lines or check what the last words are for every line to see, have you managed to make this a formal poem or not? Because, and for instance, that one, with Chrysalis, which now I've lost where it is. Come on, David. You would think after I earmarked all of these things that I should be able to find.
It's page 45.
And I can't, but, oh. Yes, I found it. Every line, so it's 6 line stanzas, and every stanza has one of 6 words, or every stanza the lines end with the red and wonders. So first off, what form is that?
That is a sestina.
Okay. And there's a few, so there's chrysalis, there's sestina noir, and
Still
there's
life.
one other one, I think. Right?
Yeah, still life.
Remember what the other one is.
It's the oldest.
Still life. Yep.
Yeah. It's the
And
oldest.
they're each in their own section. So still life is in one, noir is in section 2, and then are those all the sestinas then?
Yep. Yep.
I think those are the ones that style leaps out at me first. And then of course there are the sonnets like raw bar. And there's one I wanted to ask whether it was a sonnet. It was towards the end here. Home record.
Yep.
Is that a sonnet?
Yes, it is.
It is.
14 lines of iambic pentameter.
Sure. But you divided it up in everything instead of going like, a stanza 4, and then, 6 at the end. You have it broke up by 3s.
Mm-hmm.
So why?
With sonnets, there isn't actually a rule of how you break it up. Like it can be just one block of text like raw bar, or you can break it into stanzas. Like there's nothing in the form that dictates how you divide the stanzas. The rules of the form are just that it has to be 14 lines of rhymed iambic pentameter. So you have some freedom about kind of how it looks on the page. So yeah, for raw bar, I kind of wanted a little dense little poem, like a little oyster. And for home record, I kind of wanted a little more air and space between the stanzas to kind of tell the story. Yeah, I love form. A lot of the poems in the book are formal. I try to hide it. It is kind of my party trick to sort of like.
That's what I was thinking. When I saw home record, it's like you're trying to hide that it's a sonnet.
It's more like and maybe that's me trying to sort of hide the artifice of the form. But I think
right.
I like to use I like the challenge or the juxtaposition of kind of using contemporary language and idiomatic speech and putting that in like a very old, strict form. For me, that's fun. Some people would probably consider that masochistic, but I like the rules, and I feel like they
open to read.
More creative possibilities for me. I feel much more at sea when I'm trying to write free verse. So for me, kind of, sometimes I set out to write in a particular form. Other times it may start as free verse, and as I'm working on it, it'll just start to go in the direction of a form. Like they'll just start to become a refrain, or they'll start to be a meter, and I'll be like, oh, I think this poem wants to be a sonnet. I know that sounds weird, but it does sometimes feel like the poem talks to you and sort of like tells you what it wants to be. Yeah, I just think a lot of people, and even when I'm not writing in a form, I like to just kind of like be very intentional, I guess, about like how the poem looks on the page and like, the sound. I try to just like think of them as, pieces of music, and just try to use. I think I like to read poems where I feel like the poet is sort of in control and like is making kind of intentional choices to control my experience of reading it. It sounds very controlling, I guess, when I put it that way, but I like that, and I kind of, I am definitely kind of a formalist, but I'm also super narrative, and a lot of forms really challenge or resist narrative. Like it's very hard with a form with a ton of repetition to tell a story, because how does the story move forward if you keep circling back on the same word or idea? But a lot of my stories involve kind of, some level of sort of obsessiveness. So, you know,
Right.
I think it can be used to dramatic effect, for certain stories, but you know, it is challenging to sort of have a narrative villanelle. Um, but
Mhm.
you know, I just tend to really like to tell kind
Then what happens? And I think maybe if, you know, when I write form, it sucks. Um, and I think maybe in part because I don't write a lot of narrative poetry. And so I think that in that case, maybe it sticks out more that, hey, here's a form, you know, as opposed to if I were telling a story. Um, so do you ever set out thinking I'm going to write a, I want to write on this topic, it's going to be this form?
sometimes.
Or is it more I'm writing on this topic and okay.
I think it's both. I think I
And
can think.
so out of your form, so out of what is your favorite form?
Uh,
Or do you have one? Or
I used to be a Sestina, now it might be a Villanelle. You know, that's a tough question. It's like, which of your children do you love the best? um, I like them
I
all a
know.
lot. Yeah. um, but yeah, I think if you don't notice it, that's not a bad thing necessarily. You know, I think it's, you want to make sure that I always try to make it, you know, want it to feel like the words that are there are the words that should be there, sort of regardless of the form. So it isn't just like, oh, I have to rhyme with this word, so that's why I chose this word. You know, like you want to feel like it's the right word anyway. Um, but
Right.
all right. Well, I feel like we should let people go. I love talking about poems. I would talk about poems
Okay.
all night with you, but
No.
you know, I think we're pushing up on the hour and a half. So um, I would like to just like thank you again,
Yeah.
David, and also uh, say that you know, the organization that you created, Gree Literatura. We host classes, and I teach a class on the first Wednesday of every month, and I look at different poets usually and kind of explore their work. So you can follow Greenlit on Facebook, Instagram to find out about kind of when those classes are happening. So if you want to take a class with me, it's fun. It's on Zoom right now.
And we
Um,
have our own website.
yes, yes. So yes, the Gree website. Maybe somebody, oh, I can put it in the. I'm putting it in the chat. Hopefully you can sort of cut and paste that. But yeah. Sign up for a class or come to our other events. And I hope everybody has like an awesome night. Thank you so much for people who tuned in. This was a really fun experience. My first time being live on YouTube. David, anything else you want to say before we say goodnight?
Should we point out that we actually do have a monthly class on formal poetry too?
We do, and I believe the instructor Lisa is watching. But yes, on Tuesdays we also monthly do a class on Zoom. The next one's on villanelles this month. So next Tuesday, if you want to learn more about poems like Imitation Crab,
Yep.
you can sign up. And yeah, I hope everyone's having a great night and a great March. And I'm thrilled that you came to hear me read my
Yeah.
poems. Um, I love all of you. And I'm going to say goodbye.
Thank you so much. We
Bye.
will see everybody later.
Yeah.
Bye.